Good evening and welcome to everybody, all our listeners and viewers. So my name's Arthur Hill. I'm chairing the session tonight, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce David Wynne as our speaker tonight. David has a wealth of experience in engineering. It would take all evening to actually cover all the things that Dave knows and does in the various roles and hats that he wears. But it's probably best for Dave to actually explain in detail what he does. Dave, in my view, is Mr. TickITplus. Without Dave, there would not be TickITplus, and that's not an overstatement. So I'm the secretary of the International TickITplus Association, and we are the scheme owners of TickITplus. So I'm very happy to have Dave talk about the scheme and the benefits that it brings. So Dave is an active auditor. He works in the fields of quality, information security, and business improvement in general. Dave also has his own website, which is an absolute mine of useful information. So I'm sure Dave will introduce you to that in due course. Just a little bit on the logistics of having a virtual meeting. Can we give Dave a free run to do his presentation, and we'll take questions at the end. If questions occur to you during the course of Dave's presentation, please put them on the chat and we will go through the chat questions at the end. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Dave and I shall disappear off your screens.
Okay, so thank you very much for that introduction, Arthur. Very kind words said there. What time is it? Good evening, everyone. Yes, and welcome to the presentation I'm going to do on the key features and benefits of TickITplus. And it's not just a 45-minute session on all the technical details of the TickITplus scheme. It's more of a rounded picture of how TickITplus can help address a few of the things that I've observed, or we all may observe in the day-to-day businesses and the process operations within businesses that many organizations encounter. And I've tried to include in it some sort of representative examples of things to illustrate what the benefits, or what some of the benefits of TickITplus can be. So just to get off, I'm sure you all have heard of TickITplus, or at least of TickIT. Bit of background to TickITplus just to sort of set the scene. Obviously, TickITplus came about from the old TickIT scheme, which was running for many years. Started way back in the late 80s, just after the release of 9001. 9001 was hailed as the first sort of international standard of quality after BS 5750, and it was very much, I believe, oriented to manufacturing, sort of the traditional scope of things. And there was a lot of interest in how it would be applied to software engineering, software development, which from the DTI's point of view kicked off the initiative around TickIT, and introduced the TickIT guide, which we all know was not a standard in its own right. In fact, the only requirement in it was to use TickIT auditors. It was made up of 6 parts, which I've listed through. But the interesting part was the last ones, which was not really given a lot of attention. It should have maybe been given a bit more attention, which was software quality management system requirements, process perspective. So, way back in the early days, we were already starting to talk about process-related models, process-related standards, etc. We've taken that from the late 80s, when I say the emphasis was predominantly on quality inspection and control. The sort of aim was predominantly around software development, the classic sort of just standard life cycle model, or maybe the waterfall or V model coming into play, but very much aimed purely at the software development activity. It was only a guidance, as I said, and it was very, very heavily linked to ISO 9000, which in turn gave rise to sort of a pass-fail result, ignoring the arguments over minor non-conformities and whether that's a grading or not. The result was either a certificate or not a certificate. So early in the noughties, around 2009, 2008, 2009, the TickIT committee sort of started looking at where do we take things in the future. You know, how do we improve the TickIT scheme? How do we make it more relevant? What do the organizations want from it? How do they want to use it? And the committee started looking at what's around, including looking at things like CMMI, the capability maturity model approach, and other aspects that were starting to come about. And there was a sort of survey done, a sort of general fact finding to find out what organizations were interested in, what they were doing, what they wanted. And then, or back in 2009, we sort of looked at these things. And what was coming out of it was that there was a greater emphasis being placed on process capability and improvement rather than on compliance. You know, organizations had been using ISO 9001 for many years. They knew and they understood the compliance side of things, but what they were seeking from a sort of improvement model or a third a sort of TickITplus scheme, if you like, was something that helped them understand the process capability, and from the process capability, the real need to improve what they're doing. Many organizations often can't see the wood for the trees because they're so close to it. And even today, you know, in today's terms, I'm still auditing organizations where I see something and they look at themselves as if to say, well, why haven't we seen that? So we, you know, from a third party point of view or a third set of eyes perspective, you know, the emphasis there on process capability and improvement from that point is something they design. The IT sector today is hugely diverse, much more diverse than it was back in the 80s. You know, we have security, we have safety, we have business continuity. All of these things are hugely more important as software and IT systems become much more dominant in everything we do. An interesting thing we picked up on was that organizations value clearly specified requirements. You know, the thought that guidance was good and they could follow it. Actually, what people were saying was, tell us what the requirements are and we'll implement them to our benefit. So, you know, don't give us these woolly bits of guidance, you know, which we may or may not interpret and use, but tell us what the requirements are and we'll go away and include them. And one of the interesting things we sort of got out of some of the feedback was the organizations are, particularly the big organizations that use a lot of suppliers, they're looking for better differentials in supplier selection. I mean, let's be honest, everybody that needs ISO 9001 has got ISO 9001. And when you're doing a supplier selection, it's a useful thing to have, but everybody turns up with the same old certificate saying, yes, we've got ISO 9001. And what we're really needing to see is, you know, where are suppliers good? What are they good at? What are they very good at? What are they less good at? And can we work with them where they're less good at it and capitalize on where they're good at doing it? What we don't want is surprises, and therefore it's very useful in supplier selection to know up front where the risks are, where the issues are, and be able to make judgments on whether we can work with suppliers in a partnership arrangement. And so we want something that helps us understand the performance of suppliers rather than just a certificate that says, yes, they comply with a particular standard. So from all of this, we took these sort of general principles and started implementing the TickITplus scheme. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details and all the specifics, but what I'm doing is going to pull out some key things that the TickITplus scheme that has got that does make it stand out above some of the other models, the other standards, and what have you. The first thing that we really need to sort of recognize is that TickITplus is an umbrella that's embracing a number of standards, 9001 being the core standard, but we've also incorporated ISO 20000, ISO 27001, more recently ISO 26262, which is around functional safety, and there are others planned to come along in the near future. Particularly one of the ones we're looking at now, which has got a little bit more flavor to it from various organizations, is ISO 12207 and 15288. In fact, very funnily, going all the way back to the TickITplus scheme, sorry, the ticket scheme guidance that had 12207 in it as a good representative process model. It's also very flexible. We've tried very hard to make the standard usable by many more organizations than just purely software development. And we've done that in addition to making it flexible across the standards. We've made it flexible across the way organizations want to use it. And I'll cover a little bit of that as we go through. It's got a very well defined measurable improvement process to it, based very clearly on the capability model concepts, particularly around 15504, which we've used as a basis for putting together the TickITplus scheme, and that's been around for many years. And that really draws on the difference between just doing changes and trying to do improvements, and the difference between that and understanding the effect of improvement and maturity of the process, and hence potentially risk reduction that comes about by maturing the processes. So we've incorporated a sort of a measurement improvement cycle into the scheme. We've also looked at where you get benefits from, and within the TickITplus scheme, we can do joint assessments. We can create an assessment team that includes both the external third-party assessors, and we can include some internal personnel on the assessment team to work together to look at the organizational processes that we're assessing, and to come out with real meaningful improvements from what the team has observed. There are rules, there are protections around conflict of interest, and certain other rules in the scheme to help mitigate any risks of that. But where I've done joint assessments, particularly in the CMMI world, I often find that a joint team provides much richer, colorful, meaningful results that feed back into the organization, and more often get more rapid buy-in from the organization than if it's purely an external auditor doing an audit against an international standard. So there's a degree of buy-in by having the organization's own team or team members as part of the assessment team. And finally, one of the strongest parts, I think, from the TickITplus scheme is the idea of outcomes over outputs. And I'm going to go into some of that in some of the later slides, and sort of explain what we're trying to get out of a concept of looking at outcomes rather than just the outputs, and why outcomes are actually more important to a business in terms of identifying improvements than purely outputs are. So I picked maybe 5 areas of the TickITplus scheme that I'm just going to start talking through and showing how they can be used. I think one of the first things we need to talk about, though, is what this standard is all about. And it is very much about improvements. And the question is, well, what are we trying to improve? Well, I could say we're trying to improve quality. But that's a very difficult word to actually get a universal agreement on. Now, that's my Mini, my first car back in, when was it now? About 1980, 1979, 1980, something like that. And it was my first car I got. And, you know, as we say in Yorkshire, it were right good quality. And when we say that, what we're really meaning is something that illustrates what I think is a good definition of what we talk about quality. If we think of quality, well, the first thing we've got to think of is the quality pyramid, because there are basically three things that come together to demonstrate quality. The first one is, have we got what we want? Is it functionally achieving what we want it to do? Does it work? Does it do what we've set out for it to do? And certainly from my Mini, it did exactly what I wanted to do. It was my first car, and it allowed me to get from A to B without getting wet on a motorbike. So that's the first question we've got to ask is it what we want it to do? The second question is, can we afford it? You know, can we pay for what we want? And we have to balance the two together to understand whether what we want is what we can afford to pay. And I think I paid about 150 quid for the Mini, which was about as much as I could afford. So I was quite happy. And the third part of quality is time. When do we get it? Do we get it now? Do we get it later? When do we actually get hold of what we want for the price we want? And all of those three parameters have to come together to give us what we want. And if we get what we want, then we really could say it were right good quality. So let's look at this a bit further. Quality systems then. Well, under the definition of what I've just said, is there such a thing as a quality system? You know, I don't think there is really. You know, it's so variable, the word quality. What we're looking for is a delivery system that delivers the right thing for the right price at the right time. And, you know, we could start off with that's a delivery system. We could move it a little bit further and say, well, actually, what we're really looking at is the management system behind delivering what we want when we want it for the right price. And if we think about that, well, isn't that what businesses are in business for? To deliver what people want when they want it for the price they're prepared to pay for it. So what we're really talking about is a business system. And so what we're trying to do here is get a model, a ticket, in our case, the TickITplus scheme, to help us deliver that business requirement, those business systems. So we tend to think of our TickITplus as a business management system. So let's take a little bit further look at how TickITplus can help us. So what are systems, first of all? Well, we're talking about a management system. Now, in most organizations, there are two major components to the delivery process, if you like. There are people and there are tools, facilities, and equipment. I'm ignoring for the time being the concept of raw materials in a manufacturing sense, because we are looking very much at the sort of IT intellectual sort of development activities. But in general, we have people and we have tools, facilities, and equipment. And if we simply take the people and give them the tools, the facilities, and the equipment, what we tend to end up with is anarchy, chaos, confusion, and really not achieving what we want to do. Now, in most cases, neither people nor tools, facilities, or equipment will actually provide long-term benefits for any organization. Now, I say that carefully because people can move, they can retire, they can change roles. If there's an employees market, they can easily get other jobs. So if your organization has purely built its delivery system, its management system, on the fact that it has experts, heroes, competent people, if that's all they built it on, they run a big risk of things failing if the people should move, retire, or any other reason they shouldn't be there. And similarly with tools, facilities, and equipment. Everybody can buy the same tools these days. Everybody can get hold of the same facilities. They can get hold of the same equipment. You really don't gain competitive advantage by thinking you've got the best tools, facilities, and equipment, because anybody can do the same. And in fact, anybody can then get hold of better tools, facilities, and equipment should they be released. So you can't really capitalize or have any long-term benefits simply by looking at people or equipment in isolation. And if you stuff them together, well, you can actually do more damage than you really want. What you do need, though, is process. And what process does it brings together the people and the tools, facilities, and equipment in the most optimum way for the particular organization that we're thinking about. And the real advantage is that process is absolutely the prerogative of the organization. It's down to the organization's ability to bring people and tools, facilities, and equipment together using processes that they understand work effectively for them. And that is where organizations get their competitive advantage, is in how clever they are at integrating people, tools, facilities, and equipment. So looking at TickITplus, we first of all mentioned earlier on that it's an umbrella for various standards. And the standards that we've got in at the moment are 27001, 9001, 26262, 20000. We have PAS 754, which is now being moved to a British standard 10754 around software trustworthiness. So we've tried to bring all of these standards in that represent from an IT, from a systems engineering point of view. We've tried to bring them all in to be available to the organization to use to help them develop their management system or their business system in achieving their delivery goals. Before we go any further, I just wanted to mention that all of this now is available free at www.TickITplus.org. So unlike previously a few years ago when there was quite a few of these things were chargeable, what we've decided to do within the committee is to make them all freely available for you to download and use as best you can. Okay. So getting back to TickITplus, one of the things I talked about earlier, and particularly from the 12207 standard, was the idea of development processes or processes within the management system. And within TickITplus, we've identified 40 key processes that fairly well cover all the sort of typical uses of the TickITplus scheme. We've got the mandatory type A processes, which very much relate to the management elements within any of the standards. So managing resources, having a quality management system in the first place, understanding corporate management and legal aspects, so senior management commitment, infrastructure and work environment improvements, measurements, customer focus, risk management, and data management. So those are typically applicable to any standard that you wanted to look at, and they pretty well form the organizational infrastructure for achieving any desired management system or improvement to the management system. Underneath that, we then have what we call the scope-dependent type BC processes, and these are the operational processes that relate to the particular activities that are being undertaken. So we've got processes that concentrate around software development or systems engineering. We've got them around security management. We've got them around service management, etc. So we've built a model there which consists of the sort of key processes that need to be in place to support the business, and then the operational processes that help deliver what the business is trying to deliver. We do have a few what we call type N processes, and they are very much for organizations that want to go up the maturity levels and start looking at their processes in a quantitative manner, and I will touch a little bit on what that means a little bit later on. Okay, so we've got multiple standards and we've got multiple processes within the model, and the important thing is, how do we tailor them? How do we make the model flexible so that people can use what's applicable and what's relevant to their organization, yet at the same time make it a comparable standard, i.e. you can get a result from it that allows you to be compared in terms of your achievement with other organizations that are using the TickITplus scheme. And we do that through a number of mechanisms, particularly one here. We do it through each process within the TickITplus scheme has a number of columns at the right-hand side, which addresses all the standards that we've incorporated and identifies them against, in terms of their clauses, against practices that we've built into the TickITplus scheme processes to help implement the TickITplus processes. And I'll go over that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But I just wanted to stop slightly from the TickITplus thing and take a little bit of a look at what do we really mean by processes, and particularly the value you get from having good processes. And hopefully what we've tried to do within the TickITplus scheme is write a set of good processes that you can use in a fairly easy way. We've written the process, the base practices very much around what we would call business speak rather than standard speak. We've tried to write them in a way that you would recognize the sort of needs within there in terms of a business organization and a business approach. But let's just take a look at the value of good processes and what they mean. Now, I'm sure you all recognize the Rubik's Cube. I'm sure you've all probably had a go at it at some point in your past. Some of you may be experts at it, some of you may not. I would ask the question, though, for you to think about. I know we're not doing this live, but to think about how many starting positions there are in a Rubik's Cube. Just a thought on that. You know, is there 1 million? Is there 10 million? Is there 100 million? Or is there 5? Is there? When you actually do the mathematical calculations on it, there are 43 quintillion different starting states for a Rubik's Cube. Now, I will admit that some of those states will look similar. If you rotated the top row by 90 degrees, it would look the same, but technically it is a different starting state. So I've just done the pure maths on the Rubik's Cube. So that's like we have a problem to solve, as we do in software, as we do in systems engineering, as we might do in service provision. We've got to solve something to satisfy the customer's requirement and deliver it. Now, the real question is, I would ask, is how many methods are there to solve a Rubik's Cube? Now, I'm not talking about how many moves are there. I'm talking about how many methods are there. How many different ways can you approach the solving of a Rubik's Cube? And it's not much different to how many different ways there are to solving a software development problem, a service delivery issue, or solving a customer requirement that you have to deliver. How many different ways? And I would sort of start by saying there's potentially 3 different ways you can solve most problems. Now you're probably scratching your heads thinking, well, you know, hang on a minute, what are we talking about? 3 different ways. Well, if you think about it, the first way we can solve it is randomly. We can simply randomly turn the Rubik's Cube, doing it over and over and over again until maybe one day we achieve the right answer. You know, we're not trained, we haven't got any particular tools, we don't really know what the process is, we're just randomly doing stuff. The chances of that succeeding, well, if it's me, very, very slimly. You know, you just could go on forever. The second way, and I think some of you may recognize this from maybe past experience, we could do it in a very dubious way. We could just simply dismantle the Rubik's Cube and we could put it back together to make it look like we've solved the problem. Now, that's great for solving the problem, but if you think about that in a real world scenario of developing software or developing a solution, we've probably missed out all the mandatory steps that we should really be going through. If it's software development, we may have missed out code reviews, we may have missed out testing, we may have missed out design reviews, we may have missed out other aspects. We may have missed out legislative things, we may have missed out mandatory company requirements. We've simply gone from the requirement to the solution and bypassed any of the intermediate activities. The third way to do it, as you might have guessed, is that we can successfully do it following a process. Okay. Now we can have a process and we can achieve the Rubik's Cube. And when I looked this up on the internet, and this is all available on the internet, it turns out that you can solve a Rubik's Cube in a minimum of 26 moves. No matter how it starts in any one of those 43 quintillion starting positions, you can solve a Rubik's Cube in 26 moves if you follow the defined process. And that means that any one of us who may or may not be able to do a Rubik's Cube, if we're given the process and it's understandable and it's presented in the way that suits the situation, we can all start to solve the Rubik's Cube on a repeated basis. We will start off slowly, but given that the process is defined, with repeatability comes knowledge and understanding, and that therefore drives improvements in speed and delivery and schedule. So the moral of the Rubik's Cube is we have to have a very well-defined process that we know works, and it has to be communicated to us in a way that we can understand and achieve the desired goals from the way the process is described. The second area I'd like to do is what is a model? Now, we talk about management system models, we talk about improvement models. We've got to think about, well, what actually is a model in practice? The first thing that comes to mind is that a model is a kit of parts that we put together and achieve a result. Well, for maybe a definition of model, but for what we're looking for in the management world, the systems management world, it's not a kit of parts that comes together in one way, because that doesn't give any of us a competitive advantage. It just helps us all achieve the same thing in the same way, looking the same. What we're really wanting is a model that gives us building blocks that allows us to create our desired results, whatever the organization situation we're in, that enables us to create a management system that suits what we're trying to do, and how we're trying to do it, and works well with the tools, the equipment, and the facilities, and the people that we've got, and actually enables them to come together to deliver what we're trying to achieve. So going back to TickITplus, the flexibility element that I mentioned, what we have are 8 scope profiles. And we've defined those 8 scope profiles in line with the typical users of the TickITplus scheme. So we've got the standard systems and software development and support, we've got service management, we've got information management and security, with IT systems engineering and infrastructure, and we have some less common ones, legal and compliance, product validation, quality and measurement. And the idea here is that rather than just taking TickITplus as we did with TickIT and trying to force everybody down the same route, we now say, pick the most appropriate scope profile for the type of work that you're involved in within your organization. From that, we have a mapping between the scope profiles and the 40 processes that we've identified. And from the mapping, we can decide which processes are key to the particular scope profile that you've selected. And then from the processes that we've selected, we then have additional outcomes in the processes that map to the standards to allow you to incorporate particular standards that you're interested in, whether it be 9001, 27000, 20000. So the scheme is very flexible around the types of organizations that want to use TickITplus and the standards that they're interested in using within their organization. So we have one TickITplus scheme, which gives you a TickITplus result, but within that, you can identify the particular area of interest you've got around the scope and the particular standards that you want to adopt or demonstrate. Okay. So we now need to move on to actually what is an effective management system, because that's what TickITplus is trying to give you, a system that's effective. And I just got a quick slide up here that I pulled up. Saying that this is an effective quality management system, it's got all the processes, procedures, records, outputs, documents that you might expect, is like saying that this is an effective watch. Now, it's got all the pieces of a watch. It's got a watch face, it's got watch hands, it's got casing, it's got wind-up mechanisms, it's got all that, right? The real difference is, what time does that watch say? And we don't know. So just having all the bits doesn't mean you have an effective system. So if you've got an internal audit program, you've got a management review program, you've got corrective action, you've got customer feedback, customer complaint handling, management reviews, peer reviews, design reviews. Just because you say you've got them all doesn't mean to say you have an effective system. The important thing is, how do you bring them together to deliver the results? So going back to my defining a process, we've got to look at the people we've got and the tools that we're using. And from that, we can identify certain characteristics of the process we need to have in place. So if we've got unskilled, inexperienced, unfamiliar people using manual or no tools at all, then we do need quite detailed instructions, regular supervision, high levels of checking, and probably low levels of measurement. As we move across and introduce more advanced tools, we tend to find that the instructions turn into manuals of how to use the tools. We still have fairly regular supervision. We're starting to drop the levels of checking because the tools are doing things on a repeated basis, but we're now starting to bring in periodic measurements from the use of the tools. Conversely, if we have minimal tools or manual approach, but we're increasing the skill level and experience and familiarity of the people, then we tend to move away from instructions. We tend to move towards guidance in terms of helping the people use their skills to achieve the results. We still have periodic supervision going on. We have periodic checking and periodic measurement. So again, we're moving away from very specific instructions, regular supervision and high checking, and we're moving in two directions depending on the skills of the people and the benefits received from the tools. Ultimately, where we would like to get to is very skilled people using highly advanced automatic tools. And in that scenario, we tend to end up with very minimal documentation, minimal supervision, low levels of checking, but a high degree of measurement on what's going on. And that's ideally the direction that we really want our management systems to be moving in, if we can get to that direction in terms of how it works. Now, when we look at how you define a process, going back to my Rubik's Cube, if I define the Rubik's Cube using a lot of written words, I could still be sure none of you would achieve the goal. You have to write the processes in a way that suits the situation you're trying to solve. Now, many years ago, a colleague of mine, Peter Lawrence, he did an experiment in some of his training he was doing, which I thought was an excellent example of how we get process definition wrong. And over the years since then, thinking it was really good, I have repeated it and built my own sort of conclusions from it. What I had was a Lego kit, and I took this example from from learning from Peter, and the Lego kit was to build a Lego car, and I used to give this kit three similar kits to 3 groups in my training sessions that I was running. The first group only had written instructions on how to put the Lego car together. The second group only had a picture of what the Lego car looked like. And the third group had the classic Lego instructions, which are very visual. Now, when I ran the experiments, as Peter did many years ago, and I think I found the similar results that he did, when we ran the experiment, I timed the groups and how long it took them to do the Lego kit. Now, the average time for just building the Lego using the picture was about 13 minutes. Average time for building it with the instructions, about 17 minutes. Interestingly, I had to always stop the people building the Lego kit who were following the written instructions. They never seemed to finish at all. They tended to just argue over what the words meant. Now, you might be saying, well, actually, just having the picture of the car was the best way to do it. Everybody achieved it on average 13 minutes or 4 minutes quicker than following the actual approach to building the Lego car. The interesting thing, though, was there were always bits left over when they built the car from the picture alone. And the main reason for that is because from the picture, you can't often see some of the internal working of what's going on. So the people who followed the instructions took a little bit longer, but they did always achieve the precise results that were required. So again, going back to my Rubik's Cube, you could argue that the second approach was that dubious approach. They achieved the car, but they never really actually did all that was required to make sure that it was built correctly. Okay, so going to TickITplus, what we have in TickITplus, we have the base practices that I've spoken about already. Somebody's got their microphone on. So we've got the base practices, which I said are written in a way that we would hope represented how organizations thought about implementing processes. With each of those practices, we've tried to identify typical work product inputs and work product outputs. And these are not things that we mandate you have in your organizations. They are things that we would expect to be part of the process to help you achieve the overall desires of whatever the process is. And they also help reinforce what the practices are trying to illustrate or make you do within the organization. As with all of these models and these standards, we don't tell you we tell you what should be done in terms of the intent. We don't tell you how to do it. That's where your competitive advantage comes into play by integrating people, tools, facilities, and equipment to achieve the process. Now, going back to what is a process, I mentioned this earlier on. You can go on the internet, you can often very easily identify a process model. One of the classic ones is the model where the process is made up of inputs, outputs, controls, and resources. And that's a very common model to see. Now, if we think about that in a little bit more detail, let's take an example of a design review as a process. What are the inputs to a design review? Well, it's very much an easy input. There's an unreviewed design. We've got an unreviewed design that's been created, and we want to put it through some kind of design review process to see whether it's a good design, whether it does what it does, and whether it can be used in the next phases of the development. I'm going to ignore controls and resources for the moment. In terms of the output, well, we often have many things in terms of outputs from a design review. We obviously have the reviewed design. It was a design that was unreviewed and went into the process, the output of which is now a reviewed design. We may have design review records. We may have some metrics. We may have some corrective actions. We may have a pass-fail decision. We may have a decision around whether it needs re-reviewing or whether it can be issued following corrective action. So there can be lots of outputs from the process. Now, the real question I'd ask is, but is this a good process? Is it effective? And in many cases, a lot of attention is made to if all the process outputs are in place and they exist, then the process must by definition be effective. Now, I'm not a big fan of that statement. It takes a lot of belief to make a statement that says if all the outputs are present, the process must be effective. And yet, if you think about it, when we do audits, internal audits, external audits, we often check outputs. And if we see all the outputs in place, we often make a conclusion that the process must be effective. Now, I can generate as many outputs as you want me to generate. It doesn't mean that my process has got any better or any worse because I'm generating more outputs. What we really need to be looking for is what's the outcome of the process, not what the outputs are, but what are the outcomes? Has the design review process achieved its intent? Has it achieved what the design review process was trying to do in terms of reviewing the design? And the outcomes very much come from other characteristics. For example, a design that is error-free and can be implemented unambiguously, saves time, rework, mistakes, inaccuracies, etc. in the next phase of the development cycle. Okay, so we are looking for a design that's gone into a design review. It comes out of the design review, and when it gets used by the next phase of the process, or the next phase of the life cycle, it gets used in a way that's unambiguous, it's free from error, it's free from any kind of ambiguity, and can be used typically by the developers to start implementing the solution. So we can then make a judgment of whether the design review was effective, not by looking at the outputs and what they were, but actually looking at the next phase of the process to see what was happening with the design when it was being used. And that approach can be applied throughout the life cycle. So we can consider requirements analysis. The outputs are requirements review records or queries back to the customer, etc. The real proof of whether we've done a requirements analysis review correctly is whether the designers can use that requirements in an unambiguous way. And clearly that process goes on throughout the entire life cycle. So we've identified that if you really want to judge whether a process is effective, the outputs will give you some clue to it, but the real indicators will be the outcomes. And if we want to talk about improving the process, we really need to start talking about whether the outcomes have been achieved or not achieved. And if they haven't been achieved, then we really do have an improvement need. And I would argue that if an output isn't there, we may need to improve compliance by having the output presented in future. But I would argue that just because an output wasn't there and it's now there, doesn't actually necessarily mean we've improved the design review process or the process we're talking about. Now, before any of you think I'm saying we can just get rid of all outputs and concentrate on outcomes, there are a number of reasons why we do genuinely need to have good outputs. For example, if the outcomes are not as we want it, we have to do an investigation to understand why. If there are no outputs, we've got nothing to go back and review and do a root cause on to understand what was going on in the process that resulted in poor outcomes. So keeping outputs is important to understand how the process was enacted, how the mechanics of the process worked, should we need to go back and investigate it. And indeed, there are other situations where the outputs provide legislative or regulatory requirements or satisfy legislative or regulatory requirements, or indeed there are mandatory outputs that the organization needs for their particular sectors that they're working in. So there is a very good reason to have outputs, and they support the concept of understanding poor outcomes. But in terms of using outputs to judge whether a process is effective, that's a really questionable argument to have. Now, within TickITplus, for every process that we've defined, we have tried to define outcomes for those processes. And we've tried to do it in a way that enables you to see what good looks like. If the process has been implemented in a good way, what would we typically see as an outcome from that process? Now, most of the outcomes that we've defined are absolute outcomes. They're the ultimate indicator of a perfect process. Now, we're not saying that you have to demonstrate that perfect scenario in order to achieve TickITplus. What we would be saying is that you ought to have measures internally or indicators internally that show you that your processes are heading towards the desired outcome. i.e., you are getting better. The outcomes are being more achieved. The processes are achieving the outcomes on more occasions than not. So the improvement cycle is taking you towards that utopian world of perfection. Even though you may never get there, that is a better direction to be going in than one where the outcomes are failing more and more often. Okay. So trying to improve over time. So if we're going to take the TickITplus scheme and we're going to try and use it to improve our processes, one of the things that we tend to do over time is what I'd call process meddling, process tinkering, changing things without really any indication of what we're trying to see through the change. So we start adding stuff to our management system. We change stuff, we put things in place. And over a longer period of time, the system becomes confusing, it becomes monstrous, it becomes overwhelming. And we're not therefore quite sure of actually what are our core processes and how well are they working. Sometimes bits go missing because we change things in one area and that now affects another area, because within an organization, all processes are integrated together to achieve the business results. If you've got a process that's sitting on its own, you really got to question, what is it doing? And with all of that, they gradually become inefficient and we don't see it until it's too late. Things have got out of control because we're working with it on a day-to-day basis. What we really need are measurements around process improvement. Are the improvements actually improving the outcomes? Now that of course means we need to know what the outcomes of every process are in our business, and then we need to be able to measure the outcome in some tangible way to show whether we're improving. And using words like the process is good, the process is getting better, the process is excellent, doesn't really cut it. They're meaningless words and we don't really know what they actually are achieving. So we can tinker with processes, and this again is acknowledgement back to Peter Lawrence, a colleague of mine in the past, and he did a study around improvements and the potential problems we run into when we tinker with processes, when we just change things arbitrarily within a particular procedure or within a particular process without the consideration of the holistic effect on our management system. And he illustrated it with an example of Rolls-Royce back in the 1930s, where they were developing the Merlin engine. And they were developing this and they were tinkering with it. They were turning and tinkering with the carburetor, with the injection, with the various bits and pieces of it, and they were just simply blowing up engines, right? They would try something, the engine would blow up, they would start again. They would try something else, they would do it. And I don't know if you've ever tried to tune an old-fashioned carburetor. I had one on my Mini, and you could turn one thing and it would have an effect, and then you turn another thing and it'd have a negative effect. And you could go all day twisting screws and knobs and dials, and you wouldn't really get anything better out of it. And one of the reasons for that was I wasn't measuring the indicators from each effect or each thing I was doing. In terms of Rolls-Royce, along came a guy, Sir Stanley Hooker, and as the general manager of Rolls-Royce said, he wasn't much of an engineer, and that's because Sir Stanley Hooker was a mathematician. And he used maths, he used measurements, he used numbers and measures to understand what was going on. And he managed to achieve a 30% improvement in the power of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in a fraction of the time that it had taken all the engineers to twist dials and tinker with knobs over the previous months. And that really does illustrate that whenever you're going to do improvements, you really have to have some kind of tangible indicator, tangible measurement to demonstrate that the improvements you've made are actually resulting in improvements to the business that you're trying to deliver against. We go back to TickITplus, and one of the mechanisms we've got for that is the capability levels. And these try at a fairly high level to indicate whether the improvements you're making are actually maturing the processes, are actually improving those processes to deliver what the management system is trying to deliver, which is, as I said at the very beginning, is something that is what people want, when they want it, for the price they're prepared to pay for it. And we've got that through a tiered level of defined maturity levels within the TickITplus scheme. It comes from 15504, or as it's now ISO IEC 33001, interestingly, even in the new standard 33,001, the actual definition of the maturity levels hasn't changed since the 15504 model came about way back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. So the idea of a maturing capability system or management system is pretty well defined. And we've got the 5 levels, which within 15504 are performed, managed, established, predictable, and optimizing. And we've mapped them to the TickITplus scheme: foundation, bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. But they're very much an aligned set of maturity. And the idea is that as you go through your improvement programs, you are observing whether your processes are maturing and hence getting more reliable, and hence reducing risk, and hence delivering the outcomes more times than they are not delivering them. So one of the things I wanted to go up to is the perform level is basically doing the process, having the process achieve its outputs. So you actually take the inputs, you do the process, you deliver the outputs. The bronze level talks about managing that process in a managed way. And from that, you talk about the established process. And establishing it means taking the best approaches that are being managed and turning them into an organizational management system with agreed tailoring for the particular situations that you are delivering against. So that's a fairly well understood model, that, and many organizations that adopt ISO 9001 will inherently have something similar to that. Whether they've gone through the maturity, the cultural change of going from a process through it being managed properly through to establishing it as the approach to be taken in the organization, is often not as clear as it could well be. And you often see processes being performed that are classed to be organizational processes, but when you look at them, they often have a huge degree of uncontrolled tailoring or variability in them. And I would often say that's because the organizations have not gone through a cultural journey of performing a processing, understanding the management elements that need to be around the process, not management around projects, but a management around the process itself, and then adopting the best of those managed processes up to the organizational level for everybody to benefit from. The interesting two, though, are when you get to the silver level and where do you go next? And that's up to the predictable and the optimizing. And to be honest, this is where you really do benefit from a well-established system that you can then take it into the predictable world and then the optimizing world. And from the term predictability, what we're trying to do there is give you foresight into when processes are going to go wrong before they go wrong. And that's when you can take early corrective action and not wait for problems to happen and do reactive action. And one of the things that we worked on previously in an organization I was involved in was what we called predictability models. And I've taken an example and I've simplified it for the benefit of just illustrating how it worked. And this is an example here of where we had a life cycle, and I've simplified it just to a classic waterfall model, just for simplicity: requirements analysis, architectural design, development, implementation, code and unit test, integration test, system test, FAT, and UAT. And this particular model is observing the defect detection levels at each of these phases. And we particularly classed a defect as any time you required rework. So we could do a requirements analysis review, and if there was rework, we would deem it as a defect. We would do design reviews, architectural design reviews, detailed design reviews, critical design reviews, preliminary design reviews, whatever you want to call them. And any kind of rework at that, we classed as a defect because it was actually requiring some form of rework from what we expected. Obviously, the latter end of the cycle, code and unit test, the unit testing results, integration test failures, system test failures, they're much more easily recognized as defects. Okay, so what we did was we collected data from a number of successful processes who were all following our silver level standard process. So we could combine the data. Now you can't do that at the managed level because every project is managing their projects in their own way. And that's valid from a managed point of view, but it doesn't allow us to collate the data because they're all doing it different. So we would have huge variation in the data that we would abstract from the process. However, when you get to the silver level, they're all running projects and managing projects from our known baseline. Yes, there will be tailoring, but it's a controlled level of tailoring, and we understand the effect of tailoring on the measures that we get out of the project because it's controlled. However, we try and minimize the amount of tailoring that is going on by adopting good practice wherever we can. And from that, we can then collect similar data from all the projects. Now, we're not collecting project result data, we're collecting process use data. So in terms of doing the life cycle, how many defects were found at each of these phases, and we normalize it against the size of the project to get us a percentage across the whole project. And that allows us to build a model of where we find defects in terms of percentage levels. Okay, and I've illustrated it that there. We tend to find a lot at first, that dips, it goes up a bit, it comes down a bit, and then we find a little bit more at that. And I'm not going to sort of debate on whether the curve is right or not. It's the principles behind collecting data from a consistently applied set of processes and building a standard picture of what our processes deliver. What we then did was we added on so we have the mean, we then added on the range. So typically we added on 3 standard deviations from the mean to give us our variability in normality of the mean set of data that we had. So that gave us a model of mean and range. So in statistical terms, it gave us some form of bell curve of normal distribution of what we'd expect any project who followed our standard process to actually plot against. Okay, so we started collecting data from live projects, and as an illustration of the power of the model, we had one project where we collected the data and it was moving through the level, it was plotting its points within the range, and what we could say for this project was that it was demonstrating a normal or understood implementation of our process set. There was nothing unusual about the data it was collecting in percentage terms against our model of defect detection throughout the life cycle. Okay, we then started with another project and we let it run. And this project was demonstrating a very low level of defect detection, right? So in requirements analysis, it was way under the lower limit. Architectural design, way under the lower limit, all the way through detailed design, code and unit test, integration test. Now, I don't think we have to be rocket scientists to work out what happened in the system test phase. All right. And of course, when we came to do system testing, what happened next? The number of defects just went sky high. And obviously, by this point, the cost had gone out the window because we had to bring a red team in, we had to bring extra resources in. Every manager on the planet was observing what was going on. It had a lot of attention. Schedule had gone out the window because we were now no longer going to be able to deliver when we were going to deliver it, because we had to put right all the did. The very interesting thing was that compliance was still green. They were doing exactly what the process said they had to do. They were generating the test scripts, they were running the test results. And interestingly, throughout the whole process, compliance was green throughout because they were doing what the process written down said they had to do. Now, my real question is, when did the problem really start? Okay? We detected it in system tests, and by then it's too late. But if we think about it, the problem actually started sometime back in the requirements analysis phase. Something was happening, something unusual. Something not normal was happening here. Now, on a statistical terms, if you're outside one of 3 standard deviations, that's 1 in 1,000. Okay, so that project was exhibiting a 1 in 1,000 situation, which is quite rare. When we asked the project manager, you know, what's going on? Why haven't you found many defects? The classic answer was, well, I don't have defects. I deliver right first time. You don't want me to have defects. I've not got defects. And then when we went to architectural design, we're now talking about outside of 1 in 1,000. We're now talking about outside of 1 in 1,000,000. Okay, and again, you know, the answer was, I'm good. I don't have defects. Everything's fine. Everything's perfect. And we ran through all of this, and you can see the probability of something being wrong is growing exponentially throughout this. Now, if we'd actually stopped the process at the requirements analysis stage and done an investigation then, rather than when it was too late, we might have found out what the real problem was, what the real cause of this variation was happening. And when we did go back and have a look, there was a lot of cultural problems, a lot of discipline problems. There was a lot of issues around organizational structure. There was a lot of hidden agendas going on in the project that had an effect on the way the project was being run. And when we looked at it, many of those findings were to do with the project manager was doing sufficient to keep the quality process compliant, but was not actually doing effective processes behind the scenes. For example, they may have done a requirements analysis review and they may have kept records of it, but the amount of effort they put into the review was very, very small. They may have done a design review. They may have kept design review records, but the amount of effort and attention put into the design review was not effective. So again, if we'd actually taken some time to stop the process early and investigate why it was not following our standard model, why it was demonstrating an anomaly against our standard model, we could have found this problem early and we potentially could have fixed it and put it right before it had a catastrophe later on in the process. So that is the power of having a well-defined silver level process set that you can move it to the gold level in terms of using consistent measures to build models. And once you can build models, you can start identifying problems early. And from that, you can start optimizing processes by addressing root causes of problems happening later in the life cycle. I like to think of it as at the silver level, we tend to have a rear view mirror on what's happened in the past. So project reviews tend to review what's happened in the past. Project metrics tell us what's happened in the past. And if, to be honest with you, if you're a good organization, you know what's happening during the month. The review at the end of the month is just a general rubber stamping of what's gone on. What we really want are metrics that are telling us what's going to happen in the future, where things potentially can go wrong, a risk-based approach to understanding project performance. And one of the techniques that you can use for doing that is a good set of process measures around the standard process set. So I like to bring that together with somebody you'll probably all know, Edward Deming, and a great saying that he had was, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And I think that really does illustrate the power of having data around your process, your processes, your management system. And from the TickITplus perspective, we see that through what I would call having processes defined, making them repeatable, measuring them, using the measures to do predictability giving us the ability to do business foresight. From business foresight, we can put right problems early in terms of cost, schedule, and functionality. That will give us customer satisfaction. And ultimately, with customer satisfaction, we can go back to that very, very vague word called quality. And that is done through the TickITplus bronze, silver, gold, and platinum approach to the maturity levels of processes. Okay, finally, I just wanted to throw one last element into the TickITplus scheme. And that's the idea of having these joint TickITplus assessment teams of both external auditors and internal auditors coming together, or internal folk coming together to form the assessment team to understand the business processes. And TickITplus has the concept of registered practitioners from an organizational point of view who can demonstrate certain characteristics of being on the assessment team, and registered assessors who come in with that knowledge of the scheme, the model, the standards, etc., and coming together to look at what's going on in an effective, in a business-oriented, organizational-focused view, and provide back to the organization real opportunities to improve based on the capability of the process and the need to improve that process. Okay, so I have gone through this fairly quickly, and I do appreciate I've run over my time a little bit, but I would ask you if there are any questions.
Thanks very much, Dave. I can't see any questions in the chat. I don't know whether Margaret can help us there. Are there any questions?
I've been looking also at the chat without any seeing. Does anybody like to raise their hands? Do they have any questions? My goodness, I think we left people stunned. It was a fantastic presentation.
Okay.
And I was absolutely stunned by the difference and effectiveness of creating the Lego car. It's amazing.
Yes.
Oh, we've just had a question come in from Paul Bulmer, who says, how does this fit in with the trend to agile?
It fits in very nicely. Although my example of the high maturity measurement framework was based on a standard waterfall model, the TickITplus scheme does not infer any particular life cycle model: agile, waterfall, spiral, V model, extreme programming, whatever you want, prototype. It doesn't infer that. If you think within any life cycle model, irrespective of how the model is portrayed, you still have to understand the requirements. You still need to do some form of design when it's appropriate to do design. You still need to do some form of coding and testing, and you still need to do some form of integration. And I would argue that in all life cycle models, there is an order to those events, i.e., you can't design something until you understand the requirement for it. You can't code something until you've got an idea of the design that the code has to fit into. You certainly can't test anything until you've coded it. And you certainly can't integrate and release something until you've tested it. So yes, the agile model is a very different looking model, but in terms of the actual software engineering practices and principles, it still exhibits all the classic phases of any of the models. What is important in agile is the management approach to that development.
Okay, Dave, thanks very much for that. I can't see any further questions, and since we're running tight on time, I think I'll probably wrap up now and say thank you very much for a wide-ranging discussion on the whole topic of TickITplus. I think you've demonstrated your knowledge and experience of looking at different companies and different problems and how to get the best out of the scheme. So thank you very much, Dave, and we do appreciate your time and effort in putting the slides together. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Margaret now, who will do the close.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I think that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Really appreciated it.